Good afternoon. My name is Richard Hecht. As many of you know, I'm a member of the Faculty of Religious Studies. I'm now actually retired, and this is my last year as the director of the Taubman Academic Program Jewish Studies Symposium. And it's my great honor to introduce to you Graciela Machkofsky, who's going to be discussing her book, which is an absolutely fantastic book. I'm going to tell you more about it in just a moment. Here I have the cover of the book, The Prophet of the Andes, An Unlikely Journey to the Promised Land, as you know. And we're going to do something a little different today. We're going to have an interview with Graciela and myself, and I'll be asking her questions, but you can use the question and answer to whenever you want in the talk, and I will integrate your questions and answer into our discussion. So we'll have at least a three-way discussion going with Graciela. As you know, several years ago, we decided to have at least one symposium per year that would focus on Latin American Jewry, its history, its cultures. So when I saw the announcement of Graciela's book last spring, I jumped at inviting her because the issue that she takes up in this book is one of the most fascinating dimensions of Latin American Jewish history. It's certainly not limited to the Andes that she will be talking about today about her book. Let me give you a bit of background on our speaker. She is now the Dean of the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York. She joined the faculty of the, I think you call it the J School, the journalism school, in order to launch a unique program, a unique graduate bilingual program in journalism, Spanish and English. And I believe it's the first such program in the United States. She has continued her journalistic work, publishing in the Paris Review, the Atlantic, and the New Yorker, where she produces a monthly column on Latinx culture and politics. She is a native of Argentina and has won international recognition for her outstanding reporting across Latin America and the Caribbean. She was a political correspondent with La Nación in Argentina, has been a columnist and blogger for El País in Spain, and a contributor to publications in Latin America, Europe, and the United States, including the California Sunday Magazine, the New Yorker Online, and the Paris Review blog. And I should point out that this book is her 7th book, and that earlier I asked her what journalistic story she liked most. And she pointed to her first book, which is on the Argentinian human rights activist, publisher, editor, Jacobo Timmerman, who was such an important figure of the 1960s and 1970s with regards to anti-Semitism, human rights, the state of Israel, and also the Holocaust. And she's held over the course of her career some of the most prestigious fellowships, including at Harvard, the New York Public Library, the Center for Jewish History, New York University, and a visiting scholar at the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life at Columbia University. Now, I always like reading the blurbs on the back covers of books, and I hope, Graciela, you'll let me read one of the blurbs. It's from Masha Gessen, who, of course, is a National Book Award winning author for her The Future of History. And she writes of this book that you're going to be discussing with us. This is an epic tale, and it is told accordingly. From the first few pages, Graciela Machkofsky immerses the reader in her protagonist, Segundo Villanueva's search for the ultimate truth. It is a journey full of awe, triumph, and all of the other things that accompany any search for the ultimate truth. Segundo's search is relentless, by turns inspiring and exasperating and always surprising. How can someone be this inventive and this certain of the possibility of finding the answer? Thousands of people become engulfed in Segundo's quest, which outlasts him. Machkofsky's never breaks the spell, so it's only after one finishes the book that one might ask, what just happened? Was one just compelled, as though following the main character, to look for the ultimate truth in a book? Yes, and it is worth every minute and every page. So welcome, Graciela, and I wonder if we could begin our conversation with you telling us about, giving us sort of an overview of the book, and then we can begin with questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that generous introduction, and Masha's blurb is also a very generous comment on the book. I'm very happy to be here, and I'll just tell you the story. We thought would start by just telling the story the book tells, and then we can go into ideas. This is the book of a journalist, I wanted to say first. So I've been a reporter, a journalist for since 1991. So this is not the book of a religious person. This is the book of a reporter who's trying to find the truth about the story that she's looking into. And I think it's interesting to start by explaining how I found this story. This was 2003. I was in Buenos Aires. I was home then. I've been in New York for the past decade, but I lived most of my professional life in Buenos Aires. So I was there at home, and I had just finished my book on Timmerman. I had just quit a job, and I was looking for something else in the internet one day. And I saw this link, the title of this link, it was a letter by a rabbi, and the title was Converting Inca Indians in Peru. And it just caught my attention. I thought, what's an Inca Indian in Peru today? What is this about? And what is this conversion? So I just clicked out of curiosity, and I found this letter by a rabbi from Monse, New York, this Hasidic town, upstate New York, that I didn't know anything about. And the letter, I learned later, was full of errors and mistakes, but it did tell the story of Segundo Villanueva in a very compelling way. And there was this story there in this letter about this Peruvian man who had abandoned Catholicism and brought a whole community into Orthodox Judaism on his own. It was an unmediated conversion, and they were now in Israel, he said, and he was asking for money for this community. He was asking for donations. So at the bottom of the letter, there was a phone number in Monse, New York, and I had just this curiosity and this sense. I just wanted to know more about the story. I thought it was a really extraordinary, strange story. So I just ran to the phone and I called that number, and a woman picked up. She immediately recognized my accent. Apparently I have an accent, and she started speaking Spanish right away. And she was the widow of the rabbi. The rabbi had died, but she could connect me with the family of Segundo Villanueva and Segundo Villanueva himself, who are now living in this settlement in the West Bank named under the, that was called Tapuach. And so 2 weeks later, I was there, and I spent a lot of time, years, following this story, going back and forth from Argentina to Israel, and then to Peru, and back and forth until I could really complete the reporting for the story. And the story is this, is really the story of a man, but it's also the story of his community. Segundo Villanueva was the son of a peasant in a very remote area of the Andes in the north of Peru, in Cajamarca. He had been born and raised in a small hamlet called Rodacocha in the north of Cajamarca, which is a major city in Peru. And when he was 17 years old, his father was murdered by a neighbor. And the only thing he really got, the only inheritance he got from his father, was a Protestant Bible that was hidden in a trunk that he discovered sometime after his father died. And he opened this book as a book, and he started reading this book that he had found that was a surprise. And that was the beginning of his search. And he spent the rest of his life trying to understand what God was telling him through this book. And he's a reader. He's somebody who read this book again and again and again for years and years, trying to get to the truth and trying to understand how to live his life according to God's wishes. And while he's doing this, or by doing it, he created a community, a church first. He was a Catholic when he found this book, and took them out of Catholicism into first Protestant groups. For a decade, at the beginning of his search, he was a Seventh-day Adventist, and then he became very close to a radical group within Seventh-day Adventism. Then he abandoned that church too, and he brought his followers, around 100 people, into the Amazon jungle, where they could live in isolation and just read and understand. And when they were there, through a series of accidents, he found Judaism, and he realized that they were Jewish, that they had to be Jewish. So that starts a conversion that led him to first live in community as an Orthodox Jew for almost 20 years in Peru, in the Pacific coast of Peru. And by the end of the 80s, a group of rabbis, Israeli rabbis, found out about this group, went to Peru, converted them, and then brought them to Israel. And when they were there, they were brought to Elon Moreh first, and then Tapua, which are Jewish settlements in the West Bank, in the north of the West Bank. And then, more than 200 people were brought there with Segundo. So for a long time, when I was doing my reporting, I thought that was the end of the story. So if you read the book, you've noticed that the book is full of twists and turns, and it seems to have an ending, and then it continues, and then it seems to have another ending, and then it has a different one, which was something that took me a long time to discover while I was piecing this story together. He died in Israel in 2008. He's buried in the Mount of Olives Cemetery. His community, a total of 500 people at the end, because they ended up bringing more people from Peru in the years after they made Aliyah, are all settlers. It was a very successful assimilation process. His grandchildren don't speak Spanish. They're all religious Zionists, and they are happy there. And after he died, I discovered that a whole movement was sparking throughout Latin America of similar journeys or similar conversions, where at least in 14 countries that I've counted, around 60 communities were doing the same, the same conversion from Christianity, Catholicism, or evangelical groups or Pentecostal groups in some cases, to Judaism. Just like Segundo, these communities that are now living throughout the region in Latin America are not accepted by traditional Jewish communities locally. Segundo certainly wasn't, and his community wasn't. So the epilogue tells the story of a new emerging Jewish life in Latin America that has no history or roots in Judaism, that just arrived in Judaism or to Judaism, and that are living separate from the traditional Jewish communities. And a lot of these communities are trying to get to Israel. So that's the whole narrative of the book. There's a lot more in it. But I just thought we should start, just with the narrative and, from beginning to end. And that's basically what the book tells.
Thank you very much for that overview, Graciela. And I hope that while people are thinking about the various components of your summary of your book, that they'll think for a moment about something very fascinating, that there is an emergent series of Jewish communities, and you said 14 countries, 60 different communities who are discovering Judaism without, on one level, having been connected to the Jewish world, who are not recognized by other Jewish communities, say maybe in Chile, Ecuador, Peru, wherever they are. That's a fascinating phenomenon in and of itself, as a kind of new religion called Judaism, so to speak, in Latin America. That's very fascinating. But I want to start my first question with the choice that you made to start the book in the 16th century during the conquest, and why you started there. Now, there is a bit, of course, about Segundo's family and the murder of his father, and then there's that wonderful discovery narrative that what did he get from his father? He got this chest, and he opens the chest up, and there's a Bible in it. I want to come back to that chest and the Bible later, but why do you start the narrative in the 16th century with Pizarro and coming to the Incas?
Yes, thank you. So it took me a while. So I spent years just piecing the story together. And at one point I realized that Segundo was the main protagonist for the book, for the story, you know, the true story of his own life. And then the community was another, you know, all these members of this community, all these other mostly men who read the book and interpret the book with him. But that another major protagonist of the book was the Bible, because it's just, you know, it's at one point I thought the book could be entitled The Readers. And it was, there's something, as an Argentine and someone who admires Jorge Luis Borges, I thought it was a very Borgian book at one point, thinking, you know, it's this man who opens a book and the book completely transforms his life, and the book creates a new world for him, and he starts living in that world that the book has created for him. So that's not what the book, you know, there was much more to Segundo's life than that, and storied than that. And I decided that was not going to be my focus, but I thought it was important. That's, you know, that series of thoughts kind of brought me to understand, or to decide that the book needed to start with the moment in which this book comes to America and comes to Peru during the, you know, Conquista. And so the book starts with a scene in which Pizarro and his Spaniards come to Cajamarca, which is exactly where Segundo is born, and is where, you know, the Inca Empire came to an end in the 16th century. And there's a scene that has been documented and is very famous in, you know, the history of the, you know, colonization of South America, and of course of the evangelization of South America, in which the Inca is, you know, faced by a priest who hands a Bible or a book of prayers. There's no there's two different versions of which one this book was, but it was basically this book about this new God that was coming to conquest. And he throws the book into the air, and the moment the book hits the ground, this massacre starts and the Inca Empire ends at that. So, and there's still a lot of stories. When I went to Cajamarca several times to meet with people who had met with Segundo there and knew him, you know, I went to that same plaza, and there's all these stories, and there's still very much part of the memory of the place and the history of the place. And Catholicism in South America is such a, you know, it starts with this colonization and this imposition of this religion on the native people. And so I thought it should start there, because it would also, so we could trace the story of the book in Peru until Segundo finds it, which is the first chapter, right? And then at the same time, it helped me also situate Segundo's family history. I got actually through his son, who had created a family tree, how do you say that?
Genealogical.
Thank you. And he had traced all the generations to the first man who arrived in Peru. And I thought that was also a really good way to show class, which is very important in this book. The way Segundo and his family and his community are situated in the class structure of that country is very important for the story. It has to do with their search, the reasons why they are rejected, and the way they see the world, and the struggle to be recognized as Jewish. So that's those are the kind of the elements that made me decide to start there instead of starting at the end and then going back, or just when he finds the book in the trunk.
Yeah, you said something very important. You said if there's a second protagonist in the book, it's the Bible. But I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that Bible that he found, that Segundo finds, because there's a lot that is attached to that Bible.
Yes.
And it runs through the book. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the Bible as a character, really,
Yes.
in this story you're weaving.
Yes, thank you for that question, because it's one of the things I did was to try to, find through testimony, right, and interviews, the story of that specific book, but also the relationship between Segundo and that book, and then the other books that he reads. So the book he found is Reina Valera 1909. So it's a Spanish version of a Protestant Bible, and so he found that one. He hasn't seen another one. This is 1944. So Catholics did not have Bibles at home. It was rare to have Bibles at home if you were a Catholic mestizo in Peru at that time. The Mass was still in Latin, so people didn't really have access to this narrative or to this Bible except by the mediation of the priests when you went to church on Sunday. And so he starts reading this book, and it's a new book, and he starts from the beginning. So he reads Genesis, and that's when he gets, when his relationship with this God and this book begins. He's really moved by this narrative. He finds a lot of new things. He finds El Sábado, the Sabbath, which he hadn't heard of. He finds Israel and a people that is named Israel by God. And he found these people that were so close to their God. And he's really moved by these ideas. And they don't really match his understanding of Catholicism and God, mediated by this church that he was a part of. So, for the rest of his life, you saw that in every chapter, almost in every chapter, the book is very much present. And there's a moment that's very important where he finds out that he's been reading. So he finds out that there's many other Bibles, not just this one. La Biblia that he has is just one version, but there's so many other versions, and they have significant differences in translation. The idea of translation becomes a big issue for him, because at one point he's doing a very literal reading of this book, and at one point it takes him years to really start thinking and realizing and kind of coming to terms with the fact that what he's reading has been translated and that he doesn't really have the original. So he doesn't know how much it has been corrupted. And he's really trying to find meaning in every single word. So he doesn't, at one point, he's really concerned that the translator, might have changed the words. And so the meaning has been lost or has been, changed. And so he reads at one point, he and his community, they read from all of the translations. They get a copy of every translation into Spanish that they can get a hold on in Lima, in Peru. And then they go back home to Cajamarca and they read from they all comparing the choice of words and to trying to really be having kind of, educated decisions and informed decisions on, okay, so what is the meaning of this paragraph or this passage? And then when they choose Judaism, the first thing they do, which I think is a very moving, amazing thing that they did, is they when they find Judaism, they realize the men need to get circumcised, and so it takes them a while to get the circumcision because it's costly, and they needed to find someone who would accept to perform it to all of them. And then they get circumcised, and then they decide, in the way they said it and thought about it, they decide to circumcise the Bible too. So they get this Spanish language because they couldn't find a Jewish Bible, and so they have this Biblia, in Spanish still, and so they just cut the New Testament out of it, and they bury it. And each one of them. So when he moved to Israel, when he had been already converted, he still brings this, 2/3 of a Bible, of a book, with him, without this piece that he has buried back in Peru. And then it was very important to him at one point, by the time he finds out about Judaism, to read the original Bible. And but he could never really. He was already an adult, and he wasn't good with languages, and so he never really got enough Hebrew for him to really be able to read it. So at the end of his life, he was still reading the Bible in Spanish. He got, at one point I really wanted to track all of the editions that he had seen, and try to get a sense of his, bookshelves and what books were there, because that was very important. And the final point about this is that they're so dependent on these and other books. They read from encyclopedias at one point, and they try to get answers from other books. When they become Jewish, they learned about Judaism through 2 books. One is Tradiciones y Costumbres Judías, is basically Jewish customs and traditions, which is a thin book that Latin American children read for their bar mitzvah. And this is it's a very traditional, Spanish version of this book, written actually by an Argentinian writer. And then they have the Shulchan Aruch in Spanish. They have an abbreviated version of the Shulchan Aruch in Spanish that somebody gives them. And they are really dependent on these books because no one else wants to teach them. They don't have a rabbi. The local community do not want to accept them. And so they are left to learn through reading these books.
I wonder if I could just pursue for a moment, and I should point out that we do have some questions already, and I will get to those questions, I think, a little bit later when we come to the issue that the questions are addressed to. So please be patient. But I want to just pursue the part where they decide to build a synagogue. And I mean, this is a fantastic story. Can you tell us about the decision really to separate themselves and to have their own Jewish synagogue?
Yes.
And what they were doing there in the synagogue, because it's utterly fantastic. Because I mean, the issue is here, they have this biblical text, and it's almost like, it's Spinoza all over again, reading this ancient document and thinking that's Judaism, but the Jewish tradition is also about rabbinic literature and 2,000 years of history and developments and all kinds of things, which they don't have, right?
Right. They had no access to that until they get to Israel. Yeah.
And
until they get the Shulchan Aruch, actually, but yes. Yeah.
But so they're forced to imagine what this religion of the ancient Israelites is all about and how they can experience it in their own lives. Could you tell us about, the building of the synagogue?
Yes, to me, that's one of the most moving moments in their, story or their lives. These are very important. These are poor people in Peru in the 80s. That was a very difficult time in Peru, there was a huge economic crisis. There was a hyperinflation. It's considered the lost decade for Latin America, the debt crisis. And I knew all of that because, I'm from the region, but I never seen the impact of that in people's lives in a way in which I saw when I read their account of trying to build this synagogue. So they realize when they decide they're going to live as Jews, and they move out of the Amazon jungle into this kind of desertic place next to the Pacific in Trujillo, which is one of the major cities in Peru. They move there because they can take land there. There has been a land reform, and so they can take land for free. And there's all these young towns, they're called pueblos jóvenes, where people from the mountains and the jungle would just go to industrial cities in Peru and settle, and they could get jobs and they could get a better economic future. So they are one of those. They're part of that movement, national movement, and they go there, they take this land. They're always trying to be kind of in isolation or apart from the Christian life. This is a very Christian country, majority, right? Jews are 0.01% of the population. It was around 4,000 people then in total in Lima. And so they have, everybody else was basically Christian or a Catholic. And so they are, they moved to this place that is first like an empty lot. I've been there, and it really looks, it's this flat land that looks, it's very desertic. It has very little green, and it's very dusty. And they start building their homes there. They sell brooms for a living, or they are, they have their urban workers, their salespeople. They have, unstable jobs, and they need to, they realize, and they're living a Jewish life to the best of their understanding. And then they realize, they learn that to be in the Shulchan Aruch, they learn that to be Jewish, they need to have a synagogue, that to have an actual Jewish life, they need this temple, they need the place, the physical place. And so they start building it. But this is when this crisis begins in Peru, and they start raising money. They have, no one's going to give them the money, so they have to save money from their jobs and start building. And so they kept an account of these conversations for years. They met, and they had the minutes of their meetings, and they were very detailed. And I got a copy of those meetings, so that's why I have this story in such detail. But they try for years, they raise money, and they finally can buy the bricks, and they get the walls. And by the time they finish the walls, hyperinflation has eaten away all their savings, so they don't have money for the roof. And so it takes a long time for them to be able to get a roof. And then they get a roof, and then winter comes, and it's so cold there, and they don't have windows or doors. And so it's this effort, constant, painful effort to get enough funding with no means really, and to just build this thing. And there's all these conversations around how to finally have floors, and how to create, how to have, if they wanted a bathroom, and they wanted to separate, 2 rooms, and they meet there, while they're building this thing. So it's very graphic. You could see this community in this place where first with no walls, and then with walls so slowly being built around them, and then without a roof for years, and then finally with a roof, and and then really determined to building this. And so to me, it was just really about their perseverance, and how they were not going to be defeated by any circumstances or lack of means or lack of access. And they finally realized they need a Sefer Torah. They need this very expensive, thing that they can't even imagine where to get the funds for. And there's in the narrative, you see later when they are, they're found by this Israeli rabbi. He sends an envoy to meet them. And there's another very moving moment, I think, when Jonathan, the Israeli envoy, comes to this synagogue, and he's shown the Sefer Torah, and he can't understand. He thinks there's something wrong about it. His first thing, how did they pay for this? You know, they can't possibly have the funds for this. And then he notices that it's actually a piece of cloth with photocopied pages of the Bible that have been stitched, right? And they have rolled it. And so, and he told me, you know, years later when I talked to him, he told me he was so moved that he started crying.
Wow. Well, it's such an incredible story. And in some respects, there's this heroic quest in what you've written in your book. And you know, in the subtitle, The Unlikely Journey to the Promised Land, you know, I sort of read Unlikely Journey as the quest. And it's really, you know, about the quest of Segundo to find something. And of course, the reader asks, and it's the question that you want to ask the author of this wonderful book, did he find it? Did he find what he was looking for? When he opened that Protestant Bible up, translation from 1909, and he begins to read it and think about it, do you think he found what he hoped for?
He thought he found it, and then he didn't, again and again, you know. So he every time he thought he had found it, then he kept on reading and he realized he hadn't. And I thought when I was reporting and researching for this, that finally, when he got to Israel and he started living among Jews, a Jewish life, that's when he found it. But then I learned, because it took me a long time to actually get the family and friends to tell me what happened later, because they didn't want to talk about it, because they felt it was not right to tell this story and to tell the truth. But what happened when he got there is that he, after a while, he realized that Judaism in Israel was not what he thought it was going to be. He realized that there was the oral law, and that there was something that rabbinical Judaism, it was not necessarily what he had been seeking for. He was not looking for a religion or for a community. He had his community. He was looking for the truth, like the final truth. And he didn't think rabbinical Judaism had it. So once he's in Israel, many things happened. One is that he lost his leadership over his people, because everyone else, you know, in his family, even his closest family and community, realized that there were so many other people who knew more about Judaism than he did, who could lead them better. And they all chose a congregation or a community or a group. He was also told he needed to choose a group. He told him, they were, you know, the local rabbi said, okay, which synagogue, which congregation, which group? And he just thought that was ridiculous. He said, I want the unity of the Jewish people. I don't want to choose. And then he started, he found that he did not want to follow any rabbi's kind of, you know, guidance. He thought he was a free thinker. He wanted to talk to them and discuss, but he thought they were wrong at some things, and that he wanted to really continue discussing these things. And he was not welcome at one point, because he was seen as somebody who was not really embracing, right, Judaism. And then he started meeting with other groups, with the Karaites, and then the Samaritans. And he kept talking, you know, with these groups whom he thought had sometimes better understanding of the written Torah. And then what happened was that he was very isolated. His own son became a rabbi and left, and so he didn't have a community, or he didn't have people to discuss the Bible with anymore. And then he went back to Peru to try to start over with some people who have been left behind, but they already knew enough about what was happening in Israel, and they wanted to get there. So they did not want to follow Segundo. They already had rabbis they were in touch with, and they were seeking conversion. And then he came back, and it's kind of a tragic ending, right, for him. And then he lost his mind. He had dementia, and then he died. And he died. I thought also the way he died was very, very symbolic and very I don't know, moving and telling. He's at home one night. He's already an old man, and he's goes to sleep, and then he wakes up and he's trying to talk, and words won't come out of his mouth. He can't talk, and then he loses consciousness. And they are in Tapuach. That's like an hour. I think it's an hour and a half ride to Jerusalem, and his family just they take him in the car, and they just go there to go to a hospital. And he dies when they enter Jerusalem. There's a checkpoint there. The moment they enter, there's the paramedics come, and he has no pulse, and he dies there.
I wonder if we can turn to some of the questions that are come in now. And I have a question that really asks about the synagogue that they were building. And the question is, well, how long did they actually take them to build this synagogue and get this Sefer Torah that was kind of a photocopy of a Sefer Torah?
Well, it's still unfinished. The synagogue is still there. It's still lacking. Last time I went, it was still lacking some floors, and it's a very rudimentary building with 2 rooms and like a patio at the back. When he left in 1989, it was still unfinished. So he never saw it complete. And they never got a real Sefer Torah. And then, most of the people who were building that synagogue made Aliyah, so they left. And then some neighbors were left behind. And there's a whole community now trying to get conversion. Now that kind of the doors to Israel had been closed years ago because of political, question, issues of conversion in Israel. But it was never really, really totally finished.
So I want to start with one question. Well, it's actually 2 questions, but they're related. So one of our participants in the webinar writes, are any of the Latin American communities Thais seeking out Judaism from communities other than Roman Catholics? And then there's a continuation, I think, of that question. Are you familiar with any movements from other religions to Judaism in Panama?
So a lot of these groups are coming through. So there's a lot. So the big picture is there's a lot of conversions and kind of movement from one religion to the other in the region. A lot of people are converting to Islam too, and to other religions. So there's, this was a region that was very strongly Catholic for the longest time, for 400 years. And then in the 50s started this shift toward Protestantism. And because all these missionaries came into the region and decided to bring Protestantism to the region, and they started in the Andes, and then that spread throughout the region. So there's a whole now new, it's been for a few decades already, for actually half a century, a movement of, conversion that has shifted the region more towards outside, out of Catholicism and more towards an evangelical Protestantism or Pentecostalism. As you know, Pentecostalism is growing everywhere in the world, and it's very strong now in some countries that used to be, majority Catholic, like Guatemala or Brazil or other, in the region. So this is part of, if you look at the region and religion in a, from a big picture perspective, you see that this is part, you can see that this is part of a larger transformation, religious transformation of the region. And Segundo is, the title is Prophet, the Prophet of the Andes, not because he wanted to be a prophet. He never saw himself as a prophet. He didn't think he was a prophet, but it's a way, and that's explained in the epilogue, it's a way of explaining that he actually sparked this movement. He was like this, involuntary prophet or pioneer of a transformation that was coming, that he started because of the time in which he started doing his search. But what happens now is that there's all of these groups that have gone from Catholicism to Protestantism, mostly again evangelicalism and Pentecostalism, and then groups within these new churches or younger churches take a next step, and they go into Judaism. A lot of that is, there's many reasons why, there's not a lot of scholarship, but I know there's there's increasingly more interest in this, and there's going to be, I hope, in the next years, a lot of academic scholarship on this process. But my research shows that a lot of it is that it's people who do the same thing. They start reading and they have access, becoming Protestants. They have access to this reading and interpretation of this book, and then they just go to the origin and they are compelled to that. Another factor is the importance that, or the place that Israel has in the evangelical groups that are very much pro-Israel and have this idea of Israel that the Catholic Church doesn't have. So looking for Israel, they end up finding Judaism. And then there's also the fact that, a lot of these new groups are connected in the internet. There's rabbis and groups also offering conversion and migration in some cases, which is a very compelling piece for some communities. So it's not just that they go from Catholicism to Judaism without a transition. There's usually this passage through other churches in the middle.
There's a story in the book that we haven't really, brought to the surface. And I think there's a wonderful question that I'm going to read to you in a moment that raises this other narrative in the book that I think is very important, that's sort of been there, but we haven't yet, put it out in the discussion. So one of our participants writes, is any of the movement for conversion tied to conversos from the 16th century?
It is not. So that's a more kind of well-known story. There's a lot of, since after the conquest, there's been groups who have claimed Jewish heritage because they were conversos, they came, or they were Jewish who escaped persecution in Spain and Portugal, and they settled in the Americas. And, you have all these amazing stories of families, like, 10 generations later, they are still lighting candles, and they don't have a Jewish life, they don't live a Jewish life, they haven't, for generations, but they still have some customs and traditions that are Jewish, and then that's how they reconnect with Judaism. These are not, the communities I'm writing about are not those. That's why I make it very clear that they have no history or roots in Judaism, and they didn't claim it. Segundo never did. Now, something very interesting happened when these communities started arriving in Israel, when they, made Aliyah, that some of them discovered that, and there's also groups from Colombia that I followed and I did a story on a few years ago. When they arrived in Israel, they found out that being converts did not have the prestige and the, that the kind of the authority that being a converso or a descendant of Crypto Jews had. So a lot of these communities kind of started claiming some historical connection that, with very thin, proof. And there's a group now, one of the groups, that's a whole story in the book, but after Segundo migrated and his community was settled in these settlements, there was a group of rabbis, actually not a group of rabbis, there was a group that was seeking for emerging Jewish communities in the world, be it communities who claimed a lost tribe history or a converso history, or these groups, to bring them to Israel as part of a demographic battle against the Palestinians. And this group, Shavei Israel, is very active in the final part of the story that I tell, by going to all these communities, or to many of these communities, and helping them convert. And as part of that process, they published actually a book that is called Tienes Raíces Judías, Do You Have Jewish Roots? Asking people to look for signs of some, old Jewish connection, saying, for example, if everyone in your family, if all the women in your family had these names, these were names that conversas used to have. And so maybe you are a descendant of, conversos and crypto Jews. And that was a way of kind of encouraging, it was really encouraging these communities to claim Jewish heritage that they couldn't prove and they had never thought about, so that they could be converted and brought to Israel. So there's a lot of complexity and nuance in that answer.
We have another question that is a continuation of the point where you're making. This is from Professor Michael Hoberman, who teaches at Pittsburgh State University, and he was one of our speakers a month ago, and he presented a wonderful talk on Philip Roth and Allegra Goodman. And so he writes as follows: how significant to Segundo's story is the 17th century narrative of Antonio Montesinos, the Sephardic Portuguese man who claimed to have encountered Jews from the lost tribes in the Amazon?
It was not significant at all. There was another narrative, not that one, but there was another narrative that was significant at one point when he decided that they were Jewish, or and they started living a Jewish life. He started looking for, before he decided that, he had started looking for Jews in Peru. And he was not, and this is important to understand the context. That's why class and his identity as a Peruvian is so important in the story, is that he had no contacts with Jews in his town, and then in the cities where he lived, or in the places in which he was settled in Peru, because Jewish life in Peru is mostly concentrated in Lima, the capital of the country. And it's a very tight community that is upper middle class. It has a very successful economic life, and has a lot of, it's a very small community, but it was a very successful, it has a very successful local history. But Segundo did not have any contact with those neighborhoods and with those people and with those spaces. So when he starts looking for Jewish life in Peru, and what they know is that there are these narratives and these kind of legends of white people with blue eyes who came during the Conquista to Selendín. Selendín is a place, is an area not far from where he was born, near Cajamarca in the Andes. And there are legends that these white people with blue eyes were Jewish and they were conversos. And so he had heard about that. He hears about this when he's looking for Judaism. And so he sends his brother, who's another very important person in the story, to look for them. And the brother goes and then comes back, and he reports that he didn't find any Jews, that there's only kind of, Peruvian Christians there. But he doesn't have an understanding. This is important to understand his process and the story of the community and how they found Judaism. It's that they did not have this, they were not intellectuals scholars looking for, they don't have that wealth of knowledge, of historical knowledge about Judaism. They didn't have access to that. They didn't have the books. They have, they just do this kind of in a historical void, in a way.
I want to ask a question that's related to the epilogue and something you write in the epilogue. And let me just turn to it. And this is, of course, what happened to the community when they actually get to Israel. And so you write, by the early 2010s, the Israeli religious establishment and the chief rabbinate had grown alarmed. Quote, Israel may decide if it wishes to become the welfare state of the third world, warned Chief Rabbi David Lau, the son of Mayor Lau. But so long as it has not chosen to do so, it should stop the immigration of non-Jews. New restrictions, end quote, new restrictions were created against conversions performed outside Israel. Scores of Orthodox rabbis were deemed too progressive and blacklisted. The Minister of the Interior, who approved all immigration requests, added new layers of requirements. Aliyah became practically impossible to the Latin American converts. So could you say a word or two more about, what has happened in the past 12 years or so? And it's almost as if this is a prescient paragraph, given the recent Israeli elections and the push of the ultra-Orthodox to review the law of return and to make emendations in it.
Right, and that whole debate is very important in the second part of the book, and their story as Jews, as a Jewish people, or trying to be part of the Jewish people. They arrive. Bear in mind, they arrive when they arrive. So the politics of conversion are always very important. It become very important for them from the moment they want to convert. So when they arrive in Israel, it's when the Russians are coming to Israel. That was the mainstream conversation in Israel when they arrive. They are this small group in the middle of this massive migration from the ex-Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, and they become part of the conversation in the national media discourse as part of, so who's they become part of this conversation of who's Jewish and who deserves to be Israeli and get citizenship and get access to this country and its opportunities. And so there's a lot, I quote from a lot of the press coverage from those days when they first arrived. Then they, times goes by, they're settled there, and there's all these other groups that starts, trying to convert from Latin America, and now they're part of this group's agenda, this Shavei Israel, who's trying to bring them. The Shavei Israel is the same group that has been bringing the Bnei Menashe to Israel, and other groups. They are, it is a group with a very clear political agenda. They are, they are trying to bring anyone who would accept to live as Jewish, just to through the settlements, because they are part of the settlement movement. And so they kind of all these people who are left behind trying to convert and to get to Israel. And there's as I mentioned before, there is an opportunistic movement. The different groups are different, and people have different motivations, and a lot of them are very genuinely just really trying to live a Jewish life. But there's also some groups that are really just trying to emigrate out of poverty, and countries that offer no opportunity for them or their children. And so at one point what happens is that there's all these, there's 300 more Peruvians who make Aliyah and who are accepted, and then suddenly the doors shut. They close on their faces, and they can't go back there, and then they become part of the conversation. They become too visible because the numbers are growing, and they're all taken to settlements, and so they become part of the conversation of, of around the settlers and what that they mean in Israel, and the politics in Israel. And so that, and as the religious authorities are very they become more extreme and more they start rejecting this and seeing this openness and this process as not acceptable, and they start closing the doors, and they start not basically rejecting these conversions. They start creating new rules for who can convert, which conversions are accepted, and there's now hundreds and a few thousand people actually waiting back in Latin America, waiting for a new opportunity, for another political moment in which they could go back. They could try again, and they could go reunite with their families, or with or finally get this opportunity to migrate. But it doesn't look like it's going to happen for now. That's it.
Yeah. There's one last question. We're coming to the end of our time with you, Graciela. And the question, I'm sure, is a question that is on everyone's mind as they've listened to you. And the question is actually asked by, I believe, a student who writes, and here's the question: what drove you to want to write a book about this story?
Well, thank you for the question. I thought you were also captivated by the story, that the question would be answered by itself. I just thought, I'm not part of the book, and I would never, I'm just I explain a little bit of this in an author's note. I didn't want to insert myself into the story because there's no, it's not relevant, but the personal answer to the question is that there's two things that connect. Well, first of all, that I'm a journalist, and I think, I like compelling stories that are really complicated, and I like to, just research and try to find them and reconstruct them and write them. And I thought it was a really important, it was an original story, and it was an unexpected story, and it would make a good, interesting book. There's also a personal connection. I am from that region. My father is a Jewish man, but my mother is a Catholic woman from Paraguay. And I was raised Catholic since I was 9 by my mother. And I lived in, my father's family is my closest family. My mother's family was in Paraguay, so we didn't see them much. And I grew up with my father's family. And my grandmother, who loved me and I loved her, she would say nosotros, us, when she talked about the Jewish part of the family. And it always pained me that the nosotros, that us did not include me. And that, kind of shaped growing up Catholic, a Catholic daughter of a Jewish father in a country that has a very strong Jewish presence, really shaped my identity and the way I saw myself. And I abandoned the Catholic Church when I finished high school. I'm not religious. But I always, so it was not the religion that brought me to this, any religious quest or questions that brought me to the story. It was really, I was really fascinated by how they reconcile, or what they did with these two identities that are really part of the Jewish experience in Latin America, living in such a Christian world. And so I thought that was fascinating. And then the last piece is that, I am a journalist, and what I do is to seek truth and try to find the truth with the, very precarious, elements that journalists have, and and the process that we have. And so he was a truth seeker. I have my politics and my ideology are completely opposite, probably, to him. I don't relate with his politics at all. I would never, I come from a very different world. I'm a middle class Argentinian woman. But I felt that I felt a very strong connection with that determination to get to the bottom of things and find the truth, and how hard that is, and how almost every time you just failed, or you get just a piece of it, you can get all of it.
So I want to bring us to a conclusion. And, Hanukkah is just about a month away. And if you're looking for a present for a father, a mother, a son, a daughter, you ought to think about this book, because it's an extraordinary book. And we're so grateful to Graciela for spending the time to tell us about this wonderful book you've written. And for us in Santa Barbara, we always go to Chaucer's bookstore. And I hope people who may not have thought about the book until they listen to you will go to Chaucer's and buy the book there, perhaps give it as a gift or read it very carefully themselves. They'll enjoy it from the first sentence to the last. It is an epic story, just as Masha Gessen suggests in her blurb. Let me say that this is the last of our Taubman Symposia for this quarter, but we can look forward to the Taubman Symposia in the winter. We're going to continue the issue of Who is a Jew that we're ending with when David Ellenson speaks to us in January. And then we're going to have Ambassador Martin Indyk speak to us about his book on Henry Kissinger. And our colleague, Stephen Zipperstein, who teaches at UCLA, UCSB, and the Tel Aviv Law School, will be the interrogator with Ambassador Indyk. And then we'll have a luncheon with Rachel Berenbaum, who we know in the community, around her second novel entitled Atomic Anna. And then we'll end with a second address on the issue of Latin American Jews with Professor Marjorie Agustin from the Department of Spanish at Wesley University. And so let me thank you again, Graciela, for speaking to us this afternoon. And we found it utterly fantastic. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Somebody asked there about how to contact me. My email is in the webpage of the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism. So if you just Google my name and CUNY, you'll find my email.
Okay. All right. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much. This was a pleasure. Take care.
Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.